Welcome again. Just a note, we are recording this session. We appreciate you taking the time to join us and participate in what we hope will be an engaging discussion on the role of randomized evaluations on racial equity. I'm Noreen Giga. I am the Senior Research Manager at JPAL North America, and I've had the privilege of working with our panelists, Damon Jones and Dania Francis, as well as other researchers and staff to explore JPAL's role in advancing research in this space. I'll pass it over to our panelists shortly. Before I do, just a few announcements. Please rename yourself on Zoom with your name and pronouns. If you'd like, please share in the chat the city and state you're joining us from, along with your organizational or university affiliation, so we can get a sense of who's in the room with us. We also ask that you keep yourself on mute during the presentation, though we welcome questions to be submitted anytime using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time at the end of the webinar to dive into these a bit more deeply. So this is just going through our objectives for today. We do hope that you'll get a sense of JPAL North America's work on supporting racial equity research. Though our main focus is to discuss the use of randomized evaluations to examine racial equity and also engage in discussions about challenges and solutions for furthering this research. So here's an outline of how we'll spend our time together, starting with a brief overview of JPAL North America. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization or could use a refresher, JPAL is the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. We are the North America Regional Office, which is one of several regional offices located around the world. We are a research center based in the Department of Economics at MIT, and our mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. And we do this across three main areas. So first, by supporting and funding research that's run by our network of over 800 researchers. And JPAL, together with our network of researchers, use randomized evaluations to evaluate social policies and programs that aim to alleviate poverty in order to identify what's working. And then once we have that research, we support researchers in synthesizing the results and sharing these results with policymakers to help inform decisions. And then our third main area is capacity building. And in this area, we have two main focus areas. So one is supporting researchers and research staff in running high-quality randomized evaluations, and also building the capacity of nonprofit and government leaders to generate and use evidence. And we know that the field of economics has a major role in influencing policies across a range of topic areas, ranging from healthcare, education, labor, criminal justice. Though topics of race, racism, and racial equity have been studied in other disciplines, our goal with this work is to further the exploration in the field of economics. So with the funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, we brought together a committee of researchers that bring deep expertise in thinking about topics related to racial equity. We formed this advisory committee over a year ago, and on this slide, you can see the makeup of our current committee members. The committee is led by Damon Jones, who serves as the scientific advisor to JPAL North America on our racial equity work, and also chairs this committee. Our advisors come from a variety of institutions and bring different perspectives for how JPAL can fund and support high-quality research on racial equity. And one of the areas that we have discussed through this committee is holding spaces for discussions like these on how researchers in the field of economics can advance this work. And so with that, I will turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Damon, why don't you go ahead?
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Damon Jones. I am a faculty member at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. I've been working with JPAL as a scientific advisor on efforts related to research in racial equity. How's you doing? Got a little feedback there. And I am, as Noreen said, I'm also on the Racial Equity Advisory Committee. So happy to participate today. Happy to see Dania's presentation and then do some Q&A. And I'm interested in the intersection of RCTs and racial equity research. Both open to the opportunities and the limitations, and looking forward for us to discuss both today.
Excellent. Thanks, Damon. And thank you, Noreen, and to everyone at JPAL who's helped put this together. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Dania Francis. I'm an associate professor of economics at UMass Boston. I am broadly interested in racial equity work in the areas of education, wealth accumulation, land, and labor markets. And I will, I guess, go straight into a presentation thinking about what it means to do this work, this racial equity work, and trying to sort of set the stage for how we can talk deeper about these issues. So thank you. And then there we go. So I want to first sort of lay some groundwork by introducing a few tenets from a emerging field called quantitative critical race theory, or quant crit. These are not the only tenets of quant crit, but these are the ones that I, given the time, want to sort of focus on today. And one of the sort of central tenets of this emerging field is that numbers are not neutral, right? That even the way we decide to collect numbers, the way we decide to evaluate data, hold some inherent biases that as researchers, we're responsible for interrogating, both within ourselves as we conduct our research and when we consume research. The other tenet is that categories are neither natural nor given. And with this, I like to really highlight the idea of racial categories, right? When we talk about race a little later today, we're going to ask, what is race? And I'm going to harken back to this tenet with this idea that, right, like racial categories are not a biological given. They're social constructs that have social meaning. And so this is a core tenet. And then finally, that data cannot speak for themselves, right? As researchers, we're doing the interpreting of data. And when we present our findings, we're often giving it an interpretation. And if we're not giving it an interpretation, we're leaving it out there to interpretation. And so that's key when we think about whether or not the work we do as quantitative researchers is doing more harm sometimes than good, if we're just sort of leaving the data out there and leaving results out there. And so with that, I want to move into an example from racial disparities in educational outcomes. This is in my early career. I really focused on racial disparities in educational outcomes. And when I was surveying the literature on these racial disparities, a lot of the literature within the economic space, in particular, right, the sort of, I guess, top 5 journals and if I were to do a search of econ lit and, what would come back to me, a lot of the research that came back pointed to some sort of cultural or deficit-based explanations for educational racial disparities, right? So that there is some sort of deficient culture on the part of, let's say, for example, African Americans, if we're talking about what people called the Black-white achievement gap, right? That the reason for this gap would be because there's some sort of underinvestment in education by Black people or Black parents or Black students. And a lot of the economics literature was dominated by that. And as a new researcher to this field, it kind of struck me that this didn't resonate, right, with my own sort of personal upbringing and understanding of educational investment among Black community members. But that's why we do social science research, because I could have my own personal understandings and anecdotal evidence. And if the systematic review of data and literature was pointing to these cultural explanations, well, then I wanted to know. And so I decided to really do a deep dig into a lot of the papers that were claiming these cultural deficiencies. And as I did that, in my opinion, that's not necessarily what the data were saying. That's not necessarily what the theory was saying, but that these were the interpretations of the authors of data that was open to an interpretation that could have gone either way. So it didn't feel fully scientifically grounded to me in a rigorous way, the conclusions that were being made. That led me to say, okay, well, if I don't think that that's the case, let's see what do the data say, right? What is out there? And so I did a broader search of the literature outside of economics, more interdisciplinary. And one of the things that came up in the theory, if I could have the next slide, is this idea that there's lots of plausible alternatives to these cultural explanations. In fact, in lots of disciplines, I think economics was an outlier in leaning on these cultural explanations, and sometimes still tends to do so. And when you go and you talk to other disciplines, they're like, yes, you guys are quite behind in this. But anyway, plausible alternative explanations, and I'm going to draw upon work by Carolyn Tyson and co-authors who went out and talked to students and parents and families, and found that it really wasn't this sort of cultural aversion or oppositional culture to academic achievement, but rather Black students weren't taking, for example, advanced placement courses because they had a fear of failure. They thought, I don't think I'm going to do well in these classes, right? They also weren't taking them because they feared racial isolation, because in this country's history, a lot of our schools were racially isolated in the sense that those who were taking advanced courses were historically white or Asian, and those who were taking less advanced courses were historically Black and Hispanic. And so if a Black or Hispanic person were to go into these advanced courses, it would be a very isolating space for them. And so I thought, okay, well, there are alternative explanations. Let's dig into this deeper. And Sandy Darity and I wrote a paper, a theory paper that says, let's see if we can develop an economic model. And to the next slide, please. An economic model that sets up, right, one of these alternative theories to some of these cultural explanations. And I'm not going to go through any of this. I just want to point that this is a 2020 paper in the Journal of Economics, Race and Policy, where we demonstrate that there can arise a situation where two students are exactly the same in their sort of predispositions towards taking an advanced placement course, for example. And the thing that makes that creates maybe possibly this difference in choice, right, is the idea that for a white student, right, they benefit from both the ability to interact with their peers in their advanced placement courses, and they benefit from the advanced placement course material. Whereas for Black students who are historically underrepresented in those courses, it's sort of a penalty to take those courses in being able to also establish your peer networks, right? While also getting this advanced coursework. So then the only difference between these two people, right, and their decisions of whether or not to take a course, advanced placement course or not, is the representativeness of their peer group in that course. Okay. And so with that, we said, okay, so we've put this alternative to these cultural arguments out there theoretically. Let's see what we can do empirically, because there's some hypotheses that we can test based on this. And so in another paper published in the Russell Sage Journal in 2021, Sandy Darity and I test empirically using North Carolina data whether current racial divisions in advanced courses may perpetuate future racial divisions. So conceptually, we're asking, let's say a student lands in a high school in ninth grade, right? A Black student. Are they more or less likely to take the advanced placement course if there are more Black upper class students taking those courses? So we find that the racial composition of upper grade advanced math courses in high schools does affect the propensity that Black students in the lower grades are going to opt to take those classes at some point before they graduate. And we argue in the paper, and I encourage you again, yes, to look at the paper, to engage with it and make your own conclusions. We argue that our results are consistent with either role modeling or social isolation explanations and inconsistent with some of the cultural explanations that have been put forth previously. And so, next slide, please. And so with this, I wanted to further examine this idea of, okay, if it's not culture, what is it? And so I wanted to ask the question, imagine a student, a Black student who's done all of the things, right? All of the things that we said they needed to do. They had culture, they had grit, right? They persevered, they got A's, they took all the tests, they were doing all the things, right? Would they still face some barriers to taking advanced placement courses? And so with Angela De Oliveira and Carrie Dimmitt, both at UMass Amherst, we embarked upon an adaptation of a correspondence audit study where we asked school counselors, hey, look at these transcripts. Would you recommend this student for advanced placement calculus based on their transcript? And the only thing we changed at the top of the transcripts were the race and gender signifying of the names. And we also did an experimental setting where the names are blinded to serve as more of a control. And so without going too deeply into it, one of the striking results that we found in this paper that's in the 2019 BE Journal of Economic Analysis and Policy, I think, we found that for the Black female students on a slam dunk transcript, this is a transcript that we vetted with school counselors who were like, yes, this is 100% likely. I would definitely recommend this student. On that transcript, the name with the transcript with a Black female name was only 80% likely to be recommended. And on a mean preparedness score going from 0 to 10, we asked, how prepared do you think this student is? The mean preparedness score for the Black female name was 6.9 relative to somewhere between 8.4 and 8.7 for the other race and gender combinations. So here we're pointing out this idea that even if there's this perfect ideal student who did everything right, and they're still facing this barrier where their school counselor wouldn't recommend them for this advanced course. Okay, so what are some of the lessons that I'm asking us to sort of take from this example? And I'll take the next slide, if possible, please. And I should say that we are continuing this work with the school counselors and recommendation likelihood through the generous funding of a JPAL grant, and look to see some of our results from that in early 2025. We finished data collection and we're in data analysis now. So what do I take from this? My hope would be that racial equity research is research where racial equity is infused through all aspects of the project. That means in the formation of the research question itself, the development of the theoretical framework, the selection of research of the research population, or the selection of which data you are going to analyze, the hypothesis formulation, the development of the experimental procedures if you're doing a randomized control trial, or the empirical estimation strategy that you're going to use, and that racial equity needs to find a place, right, throughout the process in order for it to really be rigorously racial equity focused. Have I always done that in every aspect of my research? No, I'm learning, right? And so that's also why I think that when we come to this space, we give each other grace in learning new things. We give ourselves grace in looking back. When I look back at some of my early papers, I go, oh, look, there's race as a control variable. That's all I did, right? And that's okay, and it's okay to grow within this space, and that's part of also why I show this example. So with that, I would love to turn it back over for us to open up for a conversation.
Thank you for sharing that, Dania. Yeah, so now we'll move into our moderated Q&A, though, of course, as folks have questions, please continue to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I want to just take a step back a bit to ground us in this conversation and think about some key definitions. So how are we defining race? And I'd like to hear from both of you about how you both define race, and we'll also move into racial equity, but also thinking about how this is defined within the field of economics, just to make sure we're sort of on the same page about what we're talking about here today. So Damon, maybe I'll have you start.
Sure. So there's not one definition of race. So it's always important to be clear about your framework, and also to be aware of across different fields, the frameworks that are used. Um, I would say the general kind of features that I, tend to lean toward is to think about race as a socially constructed, um, categorization of people. And by that, I mean that it's the outcome of a process, a historic and continuing process. It can be redefined. And importantly, there are those who stand to benefit from ways in which it can be described, defined, and therefore it's also like the outcome of like a political process as well as a social process. Um, and so, those are some of the things that I think about. I think in economics, it varies. And, um, I think many people could be convinced that this is a social construct. But at the same time, some of the work is inconsistent or explicitly looks at race, maybe as a purely biological factor. I think that subconsciously, a lot of times in economics, race is treated as a fixed exogenous attribute. And so that means that it's immutable over time and space, when in fact, in the same place at the same time, my race can vary depending on who you ask, what the stakes are, and then across time and across contexts in different countries. What is my race? So I think that sometimes in economics, there's a lack of an explicit definition or theory, and you just plug it in and drop it in. And so there, I think being more intentional about what definition one is using in their study is useful.
That's right. I don't have a lot more to add to that. That was excellent. I would underscore the idea that, especially if you were researchers who are researching internationally, right? We have to be very aware of the idea that race is operationalized differently, right? And in different places and spaces. And thinking about again how economics as a field has used it and treated race definitionally, operationally. I do think of this idea of right this exogenous sort of variable that we add into a regression or we try to control for, and race is endogenous, right? And so if someone is purposely trying to study differences by race, I would say that's not enough. That's not a good enough treatment to sort of just include a subgroup analysis, right? But so like, what does it mean, right? What's your underlying theory of race?
Yeah, and then one thing I would add about race being endogenous is both that which racial group that one is in can vary over time. And, we see that explicitly in the Supreme Court in the United States and things like that, but also that it means it's jointly determined. So I'm gonna, the other variables we're interested in, are endogenous variables like schooling or school quality or income and things like that, over time, they're jointly determined with race. And so then we know if you control for a variable that is being jointly determined with another variable, that's not the same thing. It's just absorbing, some fixed differences across people and having a residual. That the interpretation of those types of analyses can be very fraught. If you just look at home value and race and control for race, and then look at the amenities in my house, um, they may not be priced the same way because both how people view my race and then the value of my home are intertwined. And so it's not as simple as just controlling for the race of the neighborhood. And so, that's an example where you should definitely go and read the work of the late great Bill Spriggs, who made these points better than I could.
Thank you.
And
And
maybe
Sorry.
there's a lot of links in the chat. Maybe someone can drop that link too. There's a lot of
Yeah.
link activity in the chat. Shout out to the link sharers, Patrick Button in particular.
I know. Thank you, Pat. I did want to just add one more point that Damon made me think about, and is how this country has spent time and energy defining race, right? We have Supreme Court decisions on who is white. Why do we need that? We need that because our laws in the past restricted assets and voting rights and the ability to own property and all of these things based on race. So we have a long history of being really vested in defining race, right? In order to have this access.
thank you. Before we go into kind of thinking more about what this looks like in the space of randomized evaluations, I also just want to get your thoughts on, when thinking about rigorous social science research, what does it mean when you're asking questions and studying racial equity? What does racial equity mean in that context? And so really sort of building off of, I think, what you both have already been sharing in your definitions of race, but again, taking it maybe a little bit further before we go into more of our questions. And Dania, I think I'll pass it back to you to start.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I think this is a really important question. When I think of racial equity, I often think of we think of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes, right? That it's not necessarily a focus on um, um, who has the access, right? But really also, what are the barriers that people face, and what are the historic barriers that people face that they are challenged to overcome? And so, with racial equity, I think it's important that we focus not just on individuals. And whether or not individuals are capable, able to achieve certain outcomes, but whether there are structures that are disproportionately disadvantaging members of particular racial groups, right? And so, I guess when I think about racial equity, I think that the key word would be to focus on structures and the perpetuation, right, of bias structures, even without people's hand in intervention anymore.
Yeah, and I would I would just add that a helpful framework for me is like looking at the kind of literature on stratification economics and thinking about race as a um, given its importance, given its persistence and its salience, it's an opportunity or a tool to be used to help to stratify people across different hierarchies, um, and that can be advantageous for many reasons. For example, if it's normalized that a certain group can have a lack of access to many different opportunities, that can produce like a nice pool of workers that don't have a lot of structural bargaining power, and that can benefit someone on the other side of that bargaining struggle. So I would look at racial equity as the opposite of that, the removal of that stratification. And so that doesn't mean that race becomes evaporates or no longer is important. There have been a lot of important cultural communities and practices and traditions that have arisen through the vessel of race over time. I don't think racial equity implies the elimination of those. I think what it does implies that reducing that stratification that happens that is facilitated by race. And one thing that, because of what we said before about race being endogenous and this being a continuing process, it also means that like a one-time fix or a one-time injection of assets or things like that are not necessarily going to eliminate the structures that Dania mentioned. And that, because these are like outcomes of, these are intentional outcomes or effort is put to maintain the stratification. It can reemerge even if you have presented a short-term solution to close some gap. So you can give someone wealth, but there are other structures in place that could erode the value of those assets in other ways. And so you can move one person to a different neighborhood, but in general equilibrium, you can't move an entire community to another neighborhood because then it becomes a community that's not as sought after. And so, you need to think about that when you're thinking about these solutions and policies.
Great. And, thinking about sort of the definitions that you both, shared and also the emphasis that you had on structural forces and processes over time, I want to, transition us into like how we think about this with randomized evaluations. So with randomized evaluations, we're, thinking about the causal impact and keeping the definitions in mind that you both shared. And also thinking about sort of the role of randomized evaluations. How can research questions within economics and using RCTs be asked to address questions like ask questions related to race and racial equity, like intentionally and thoughtfully, but also then be set up to address and answer those questions. So Damon, I think I'll pass it to you to start.
Yeah, I would say that I'm not going to lie. I don't have the perfect answer to this question. And I would say this is an area that is of interest to me and also I'm very curious about. And so part of what we're doing with our racial equity advisory committee is we're trying to review the literature within economics that uses RCTs and studies race to see if there are some findings that can emerge that can help to answer such a question. And so I would say that we're trying to learn. I don't have the answer to that question necessarily, but it is interesting to see what is out there, what's been done in the field of economics, and some patterns that emerge. And some of those relate back to what Dania mentioned in the last slide of her presentation, which is that in many cases, RCTs that also study race, the analysis is a heterogeneity analysis ex post. So the Tennessee Star experiment was done, and then 30 years later, someone took the data and then did heterogeneity by race. And so if the experiment wasn't originally designed to test differences by race, for example, then there's a lot of limitations to what you can do after the fact. That doesn't mean you can't do anything, but so that's one thing that we're seeing. We're also seeing like theories of race, maybe racial stratification, structural racism, theories that can address those things or think about those phenomena are not as present as you would want. And so having a theory justify or motivate your research design would probably also be helpful. And that's something that, we're seeing in reviewing existing literature. So a lot of what we're finding is opportunities. and I would say, the other thing is that there's a rich literature looking at discrimination by race, correspondence studies, such as the one Dania did, or audit studies with real people, and detecting discrimination. And those have been very important. And there are a lot of studies that do that. So that has been one piece. And we want to know what else can be done. I think a big question, as Dania raised about structures, is can an RCT can you identify the effect of a structure with an RCT? And it sounds immediately like no, because a structure is a like equilibrium, a society-wide equilibrium. And so do you need to have multiple societies and randomize the structures across those societies? That's not realistic. So what can be done instead? And there, I think it's going to take a lot of ingenuity. I would probably draw an analogy with macroeconomic research, where we just have a bunch of countries that went through one big recession. And how do you use data within those histories that we do have to say something about alternative historical patterns? It's very difficult. But there is some work there, I think that's an opportunity as well. And so I think thinking about that and what can be done with RCTs, especially to identify things related to structures. It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm excited to think more about it and see where the literature can be pushed there.
I think, thank you, Damon. I think that one useful place for RCTs within this space is thinking about interventions and proposed solutions, racially equitable solutions. And so maybe one of the things that I would love to see is more focus on how do we move the needle in people's lives and well-being and outcomes with targeted interventions, specifically addressing racial equity. I think that an important component to that is getting buy-in and getting understanding and getting knowledge from the communities that are directly affected by whatever intervention you're proposing, and that should be infused throughout the research process as well, right? So the idea wouldn't be, here's this feasible intervention that we think can be implemented. We've got some funding to implement it. We have some organizations that are willing to let us in. Let's say it's education, some schools, right, that are willing to let us in to do it. And so we're going to run this randomized control trial. Oh, we have some data on the racial population. And as Damon pointed out, in the end, we're going to do some sort of subgroup analysis. Whereas instead, the way to do this from a racially equitable standpoint is to say, even from the beginning, before we're even asking the question of what should the intervention be, right? To understand the lay of the ground, right? The groundwork and what's happening within the communities you're hoping to intervene in, and that involves talking to the communities. Then in the process of developing an intervention, talking with people, right? This is a thing that a lot of economists, we don't do, right? And if you still don't want to talk to people, our friends, the sociologists and the psychologists and the cultural, they talk to people. So we can also rely on their work, right? We can survey a wider and more interdisciplinary swath of the literature in order to deepen our understanding of what's happening in the particular areas and communities that we're interested in. And then that's the point, right? Where we can have these questions, these informed questions, these informed experimental procedures, and actually make a difference. The other thing that I would want to point out is the idea that when sorry, I lost my train of thought, but when conducting and there we go, and evaluating racial equity, we don't always have to make comparisons, right? It doesn't always have to be, how is this outcome different for white students and Black students? Right? When we go to comparisons, this is another one of the sort of tenets of quant crit, which I was discussing earlier. When we automatically sort of like first go to comparisons, we're automatically going to view things from a deficit perspective. So that even if my intervention really helped Black students, when I look at my outcomes and I'm comparing them to the outcomes of white students, I'm going, oh, but there's still this deficit, right? It's okay sometimes to only run your study among a population of um, uh, Latino students and say, how does this impact these students, right? And it doesn't have to be relative to another racial group. It can just be, how does this intervention impact these students? And so I think that these are the directions I would like to see racial equity work going in RCTs.
Yeah, one thing I want to add is that um, when we talk about the ex post or not having a theory of race or racial differences, a common thing I'll see in many economic studies is, and now here's a difference between racial groups, and there it is. And let me control for education. But like there's not it would be useful to know, why did you look at this difference? Why would there be a difference here? There are many possible reasons. Maybe it's obvious, but why do you look for a difference? What difference do you expect? Why would this policy have such a difference? So that's where the under theorization comes into play, and we kind of want to think about we want to think more rigorously about these things.
Thank you. And thinking about sort of designing, asking these questions, designing these studies, inevitably like challenges come up, and I kind of want to spend a little bit of time hearing from both of you challenges that you've seen either sort of in the field more broadly in economics, or within your own research. What challenges have come up in conducting research related to racial equity?
Should I can how do I I think that one of the motivations in our profession and in academia at least is to publish, right? This is how we're rewarded. And it can be difficult in some disciplines. Economics has been one of them. I think there's some movement, but it can be difficult to publish racial equity work that doesn't necessarily conform to people's preconceived notions of race, right? And so if I am finding in my work that there are structures that are disadvantaging Black students, for example, my work is going against the grain of what has historically in economics said, oh, but it's the behaviors, right? It's let's focus on fixing the behaviors as opposed to talking about the structures. It's harder to get that work published. And without publication, it's harder to advance your career. And so I think that, one of the challenges has been publication, and finding outlets for the type of work that we're discussing today. There have been journals that have been historically amazing about doing this type of publication, like the Review of Black Political Economy, which is the journal of the National Economic Association, which in full transparency, I have served on the board of. In the past, there's the Journal of Economics, Race and Policy, right? The Russell Sage Journal. There are outlets that have historically done this work. And I want to, while I'm saying that, I want to say how important it is when jumping into this area. If you have not been doing racial equity work and you're new to racial equity work, welcome, and that is amazing. Please go search the Review of Black Political Economy and these other outlets so that you are not reinventing the wheel of work that economists, sociologists, right, like other social scientists have been doing. And a lot of times doing in obscurity, and a lot of times doing without the money and the access to the data. And so when people do come to this work with a lot of resources and data access and start answering similar questions, it's amazing because we need that work, we need that data. But it becomes disheartening when you flip through some of those papers that are now being published in top 5, top 10 journals, and they don't reference the work that people have been doing in this area for decades, right? And so my plea would be, look at what's been done. Look at these spaces where people have been doing this work because they've been publishing in a time when economics wasn't accepting of this.
And I would just add that that's still the case. And also it's not just about giving credit, which is the right thing to do, to give credit to the research that has been done, but it's creating unnecessary like work and reinventing of the wheel. The literature could progress so much more if there was a continuity between ideas that have been around since the 80s, and then kind of rediscovering them, now publishing them and trying to build with less of a foundation in some of that foundational work. And that's true for myself. I find myself going back and seeing, oh, there's a paper in the 70s that, already did this. And that happens in a lot of fields, but it's more likely to happen when in the past, certain questions about race were relegated to the margins of the economics publishing and the margins of the field. Now, at the margins of this field, those scholars found homes in other fields.
Yes.
And actually probably benefited from interdisciplinary work. So it was more lost to economics. But I think there's both a kind of like moral component to that and a very practical component to connecting to that prior work. And then the other challenge is when you have referees, when you have editors, this is not their expertise. Then you have to spend a lot of time explaining theories of race, this, that, and the other, arguing about those things before you get down to your study at hand. A big question, if we're going to study racial equity, and the thought is that is, an effort to reduce the effects of structural stratification, which when it comes to race would be structural racism. If the first question from the referee is, how do we know racism exists? That's where the field of economics has been. How do we know where racism exists? In 2020, that went away for a second, but that was a transitory shock. So, we have to establish whether racism exists first. We've been doing that for decades. And so these other types of questions about racial equity are we're gonna be slower to get to those if we don't believe that racism exists as a field. And when we say we don't believe that racism exists, it's also because we haven't thought like deeply and theoretically about what racism means. So when people say racism doesn't exist, they're kind of saying, I'm not a hateful bigot, I'm not a bad person. You're saying I'm a bad person. So it can't go any further. And, so clearly defining what we mean by racism would also be helpful there. But it's a term very rarely used in econ papers.
And at the kind of beginning of our kind of times together on the committee and currently, a constant question comes up about how to think about ethics with this research. So, thinking about ethics is always important with with social science research. It's important when we think about it within the context of randomized evaluations. And now we're layering on top of this, thinking about issues related to race and racial equity. And so, Dania, maybe starting with you, can you share a bit about like the ethical considerations that you think through when you're running randomized evaluations on topics related to racial equity?
Yeah, I mean this is important, and I mean we can go in a lot of different directions, I think, with this question, and but one of the things I might um, want to focus on is this idea of what I mentioned before, involving the communities that you're studying. I think to come to a research question with some humility, right, and understanding that you don't know everything, and that there's value in what the members of the community that you're interested in helping and intervening with has important knowledge, um, and I think that hand in hand with that comes researcher positionality. And Damon and I, along with Bradley Hardy, have talked about positionality, especially among Black economists as researchers, in a paper we did for the JEL, which I think was already linked to in the chat. And It's important, especially when thinking about race. Hey, as a Black woman interested in studying race, I was told I'm doing me search, right? And that me studying that was less valuable than I guess maybe a white male interested in studying that. And I never understood that, because my question was, well, why is he interested in studying it, right? There's got to like if you know why I'm interested, I've told you, I've put it all out there, right? But I'm somehow biased. But I'm like, but why this person is interested in studying race is um, an unknown, and we just have to assume that objectivity upon them, but we can't assume objectivity on other people. So that has always been this idea of like positionality is been always sort of confusing to me in the sense of the economics discipline assuming objectivity upon some people and not on others. Whereas I look at it as uh, you're someone, if you belong to that identity group that you're interested in studying, who has some knowledge that may be useful in us understanding what are some of the mechanisms we should be asking about. Now, once we ask those questions, we're still going to rigorously, uncover data and information, and we're going to, right, like, and analyze this information. And so that aspect of social science is still there. But I think it's completely valuable to have some understanding of why people are interested in studying what they're studying. What do they bring to this? And if you don't have any knowledge of the subjects groups that you're interested in studying, what have you done to get that knowledge, right? And so I think that we have an ethical responsibility, one, to declare our positionality, right? Why are you interested in studying this as a researcher? None of us are unbiased. And I think we also have an ethical responsibility to work within and understand the communities that we're studying.
Yeah, and I would just add that with randomized control trials in particular, there's a power imbalance that comes into play, even in randomized experiments in rich countries. Um, the makeup of the experimenters and those being experimented upon systematically differs, and it's related to prevailing group power imbalances. And with respect to race, there's a clear pattern there as well. So the types of questions that are asked, the risks that people face, the interpretations of the results are going to be informed by the power structures in society. And so economists are more homogenous than some other fields. And so we bring a certain type of lens. And we, in particular, as Dania said, we're really good with numbers. With other people, it's up and down. So, are we talking to the subjects ever in the course of a study? Before, during, or after, unclear. You just press the randomization button. So I think that that is something that becomes really salient for studies on racial equity. And, a surprising thing to me, and I'm embarrassed to admit, is like um, we have to do these IRB trainings, and we have to know how to answer multiple choice questions about the Belmont report. But I would just really plug to read the Belmont report. It's like 5 pages. It's like 10 pages long. This was also something done in the 70s, but we're all agreeing to the Belmont report. I don't know if people realize the language in the Belmont report about power and ethics, and what what we require research that involves human beings. And I think it would be eye-opening to read that. If people followed that more, I think RCTs would look very different, look differently than they do.
And maybe one final question before we open it up for questions from participants, and maybe as a way to sort of summarize some of the themes that you both have been discussing so far. What recommendations would you have for a researcher who wants to conduct randomized evaluations on racial equity in the field of economics? And Dania, I'll pass it to you.
Oh, great question. So I would say, all along the things that we've been talking about, um, uh, but maybe one thing I want to back up and say is that it is okay to do subgroup analysis or heterogeneity analysis by race in your randomized control trial, but I would not call that racial equity work, right? Like, so the idea that I don't want to demonize, putting in race as a control or doing a subgroup analysis. I think that within their space, that those things are informative and necessary, but that's not necessarily racial equity work. And that if you want to be doing racial equity work, really start thinking about what I always call, what's your theory of race? Why? Why do you think that there are racial differences in this space? If you spend a lot of time developing a conceptual framework and there's no mention of race in it, or how race interacts with what's going on, then I don't think you're necessarily doing racial equity work. So really taking the time before, right, you go into any sort of experimental procedures, or developing more of your randomized control trial, if you're doing that type of work, and stepping back and saying, what's the theory? What are the mechanisms? What's driving this?
Yeah, I would add, read, um, read about race. Read it when we say, "Oh, what's your theory of race?" Like, read some theories of how race is formed. Go outside of your disciplinary box to do so. And we want to see like a orthogonality condition in order for it to be a theory. But there are other theories that are powerful that are not going to be mathematically operationalized, and that's fine. Economists know it all, so it should be fine for economists to be able to read other theories. And also, we're doing a lot of economist bashing. I'm an economist, so I'm really projecting here when I say that. And then I would say, there's also like when we see the final product of these RCTs, and race is a heterogeneity analysis at the end of a study. We do want to point out that it's not just because of the decision of the author. There are referees, there are editors, there are advisors for people's dissertations. So it's a team effort. It takes a village to raise a paper that has a post hoc racial heterogeneity analysis that's underpowered. And so, as the African proverb always says. So, um, it's understandable that you might maybe the editor told you to slap this table on, or maybe the editor said that whole paragraph about race, take it out. The referee said that. So it's incumbent upon the more senior people in the field to make space for that work and to push back when that work is discarded, to make journals and homes for those types of papers, and to think about as an editor and referee, what am I seeing happening? And then for funders, which like JPAL is doing, like for funders to incentivize upfront theorizing about race and making racial equity a part of the research design, incentivizing that with funding and things like that. And so JPAL is have a request for papers, for example, that has that. But JPAL is not the only funder. So there are many funders and government, there are public sources of funding, institutional, private, that could shift the needle by providing resources and giving people the resources to do that, and the time and the space to do that. And so, you have to do some research on racism, and that may not always be in the field of economics. Stratification economics is great, but and that's not the only paradigm. So there are debates. So be careful, don't just pick something off the shelf and then walk yourself into a battlefield of some sort. So, be careful as you are with your research.
Thank you. So I want to move into some of the questions that we've been receiving. And again, just another plug to keep using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We've had some questions come in about limited data or lack of data and what that means for pursuing sort of
Felt
research.
betrayed when I was a doctoral student. So
Someone's off mute.
And so we have a question from someone who's pursuing topic of racial equity in public school funding in Chicago, and how to handle, or like what are some strategies for navigating research gaps in the literature. So when you find sort of limited data or interest on high school students, how do you handle some of that, and what are some strategies that you have? And Dania, I think I'll pass it to you to start, especially since this is in the educational context.
Okay, so if I'm understanding, so the question is, what do we do when there's limited data in this space, and how to navigate that? Well, this is a great question. So sometimes, so part of my answer is when you are a graduate student, this can be difficult, but also an opportunity, right? You have some time and space now to go collect the data, right? So one is thinking about this is a way to make your mark on a field. A lot of times the way that junior researchers and graduate students are able to contribute to a field of research is by doing that hard work of digitizing records that were previously not able to be accessed by a broader community, by going out in the communities and collecting some data. There are rich data sources out there, and really kind of being creative, but also obviously ethical, in thinking about how can I bring in new sources to this area that we haven't had access to before. That's one. Two is building your networks both within academia and within your communities of interest, right? If you're interested in education work, people are more likely to want to work with you if they've sort of seen you around being supportive of local education, right? So it's a matter of showing a likely genuine interest you have, right? acting upon that, getting out there, making connections, and this is kind of how that happens, right? Uh, uh, Others have been a little maybe more fortunate to happen upon a senior scholar who has access to a lot of rich data and are able to work with data in that regard, or work with that senior scholar to help them get funding to collect their own data. Sometimes that's not the case, right? And so I think it's a matter of like, bringing your creativity to it as a researcher, bringing your genuine self and interest to things, and really just this sort of, what is it, like shoe leather cost, right? Getting out there. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, I would just add that sometimes you have to find clever links between data sets that have some of the things you want and other things you don't want. I think that, or some of the things you want in one data set and another data set has the other stuff, and they may be able to be linked somehow cleverly. I think that there are senior scholars who have access to the data, but may not give you the time of day. There are a lot of scholars outside of academia that have access to data on race in like statistical agencies like the census. And so you might have been looking at in the wrong direction for the team up. Reach out to scholars who, collect this data for government or for government agencies. And sometimes it's very tricky, but there are private data sources that also may have information that you want. So a university may have information on their students in the race, or a school system, or a network of charter schools, or whatever. And so you might not be able to get the population data on everyone, or the fancy tax census link, but maybe there's a relationship you can build with a smaller entity that does have data that they might be willing to be able to use for research. Again, you want to do this ethically. So those are some of the ways. And then I think long term, scholars, could do more organizing for this data to be funded and available. The census asks people for their comments. Comment on this decision we're going to make. We're about to erase the variable of race and ethnicity from the census next week. We would like to hear back from people. So, one thing I learned working in government briefly is that they take input from the public on these things and these decisions. So there needs to be a constituency that is asking for this data to be funded and made available publicly.
And Dania, I want to go back to this topic of like interdisciplinary research, because you mentioned colleagues in sociology and psychology are often sort of like out there talking to communities, that they're a great resource. And so I'm wondering if you could just share a bit about what you've learned from or borrowed from, like what you've borrowed from other disciplines that are doing this work well, and what researchers in economics can continue to learn from this work.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think I could be an effective researcher if I siloed myself only within economics, especially when thinking about issues of racial equity, right? It's by nature an interdisciplinary topic. Um, it it's right, especially right, if we're talking about our definition of race that we began with as a social construct, right? Like we have to talk about the people who brought that to us, right? The sociologists, in thinking about these things. I have found it also to be affirming as a researcher to go into spaces where people are interested in racial equity, and to have my research valued in a way where maybe at times it didn't feel like it was valued within economics. And so I say that to say that being in those spaces is also good for your mental health as someone doing racial equity research, in addition to being really good for the research. So what do? I within education, when I'm looking at educational disparities, I'm active within the AERA and other education researcher spaces, where you meet lots of non-economists. I was trained within a public policy school, and so I attend APAM, and I work with people who are interested in policy and work interdisciplinary in interdisciplinary ways. You just in the course of researching a topic and researching it well, you come across the names of people in other disciplines who are working on this, and you reach out to them, right? And if they don't respond, they don't respond. But if they do respond, this is great. Now you have somebody else who's interested in this thing that you're interested in, and talking about it from different ways. Some of the best, I guess, maybe ideas about where to go next with the research question have come from me just talking with ed psychologists, or other like school psychologists, people who are not economists, but sort of value the topic. So I think, just again, this is under the idea of just broadening your networks.
Yeah, and I would add, I think, just be be aware of the for two reasons. Uh, Again, sorry, economists, if this hurts your feelings, but economists kind of, very much look down on qualitative work, look down on other fields, look down on other theories that aren't, mathematically motivated. And so I think that you can kind of adopt that view just by being around economists a lot, or in econ programs, economics department, economics graduate programs, and without even realizing it. And that's going to cause you to write off other work. In particular, you're going to write off work that has, different language, a different lexicon, and you're going to say that this is gibberish. And people say that about economists' work too, in the jargon we use. So, we well, Joanna's right. We look down on other fields until we still steal their ideas, then repurpose them. But so in going to do interdisciplinary work, you're going to have to be uncomfortable because you don't know all the jargon. You don't know what's being said. You may think that this word has too many syllables. And, to that, I would say we have a ton of words that make no sense to the average person in the street. Okay. So shadow value, this and that, people don't know what that is. No one wants to hear that. Yeah, heteroskedasticity. That's a long word. And that just rolls off the tongue. So you will have to take other work seriously in ways that maybe we aren't taught to do in grad school. The other thing is, when you go into other spaces, people are going to be very skeptical of you. Basically, we are disciplinary colonizers. So they're going to be like, an economist, are you a good economist? They're going to ask you that. And, so if you carry the same attitude towards other disciplines when you enter those spaces, it will reinforce like the kind of the wall that they put up to protect their field from us. So you have to be a little bit humble and open to different ways of thinking about things, because we have blinders in how we're trained to do this type of research. So just another note there. And one thing that we didn't get to about tips, that's another tip that I wanted to say, is in doing our literature review, we also want to say, what have people been studying? And so I will say, if you're doing research in this area, look at what economists have done a lot of and what have they done less of. And, that can help to enrich the field. For example, most of the research has been Black versus white in US education and labor markets. So there are other racial groups and ethnic groups. What about them? whatever happened to them? So, and do you always have to compare them to white people? So, just think about what has been done and what hasn't been done.
Great. And we had a question kind of pop up about tips or advice for dealing with referees, supervisors, editors, where you have to do some of this, spend time explaining why racism is a topic worth researching. So I wonder this, whoever wants to start, but essentially, like what advice would you share for folks out there?
Yeah, it's tough, right? And I'm of a couple of minds on this. One is, in order to show up as your authentic self, right, within this racial equity space, sometimes you have to let go of this top 5 publication, right? So sometimes you send your paper where it's going to be valued. And if it's out there and it's published, then that's great. Once people wake up, then you can be like, aha, I did this 10 years ago. Look, here's where it's published, right? Like, and so you kind of like have that, and it's done. And so sometimes you let go of the ego of, but this is good work and it should be in this top space. Sometimes you don't let it go and you push, and you continue to be someone who pushes the field. uh Sometimes if your work is that good, right, then it gets into these spaces despite these barriers. I think of Alora Dorincourt as somebody who's just like out there doing the thing as her authentic self, doing it well, and still like thriving in this racial equity space. But that's not to say that right, like I've had challenges. I've had papers that I thought my job market paper was never published, right? And I think that paper should be published, right? But I spent too much time trying to push that, what is it, round into a square peg, right? I was just, beating against the drum, and I was getting those type of reports back. That was just like, but I don't think there's bias. Like, how are you, right? And so I had to let that go, and that hurts, right? And sometimes that is what happens when you're a racial equity researcher, but you keep pushing forward. And again, you find the outlets where the people are interested in this. And there's more now. There are more outlets now than there were. There are more people who are becoming into the are moving into the ranks of senior researchers in these spaces that are opening doors and welcoming this type of research. I would say I can point out many, but I would say that personally I've been helped in this work by Trevon Logan and Sam Myers when they've been editors of special issues of sort of top ranking journals. And so making sure that when you see calls that are interested in racial equity work, you pay attention to those, and especially pay attention to the people who are behind that and making the calls, and the organizations.
Yeah, and I would add that you don't want to do this too much to your detriment, but there's going to be a balance of when to strike. So, and I don't mean strike like withhold your labor, but maybe this can help you publish too. But we'll talk later about a union, but when to strike with this research. So, I agree with Dania, find the right audience, and it may not be your advisor is the right audience. And so, but you have to get out of your graduate program. So figure that out. And then the longer your career goes, the more choice you have over that audience. In grad school, you don't have as much of a choice, but then you can choose which department you want to work at. And even in choosing your graduate school, you do have a choice, and it's not that every ranking is applies to you in terms of this is the highest ranking department. They may have the most resources, but in part, I want to underscore what Dania is saying about choosing the right outlet. It's not that they will like your work necessarily, it's that they are capable of evaluating your work. So they can also be critical of it, but they will take it seriously. And so they're open and they understand the literature. And so you're going to get better feedback on your work with those audiences, not just necessarily more receptive, but better feedback, and that'll improve your work, as opposed to just being written off. And not, but it's hard to get in grad school. So you go to the grad school that you got into. You can't just select your job. You go to the job you got, but over time you get more and more leverage, and you have to be a little aggressive. So don't wait until you're retired to now make your stand. You want to do it a little earlier than you think it's time to push back and make space. But over time, you build a peer network, you have more control, you have, more standing. You keep using that, and you want to lead, you want to go ahead of like whatever you think your standing is and push a little too.
Another thing that we haven't quite gone into as much detail about is thinking about building research partnerships with organizations and communities that you want to work with. So I know, Dania, you did touch on this a bit earlier, but just looking to both of you for any sort of recommendations, practical tips, advice that you would have for folks out there that are looking to build strong research partnerships where there isn't already sort of an existing relationship, and what advice you might share.
Thank you. I think some of this is what you are maybe putting out in the universe, right? What do I mean by that? I mean, why are you interested in in this topic, right? And if there's a genuine interest, then maybe what you want to do is go out in your community, or if there's a national organization, and get involved. So if I'm interested in educational disparities, is what I do in my research. Maybe I want to get involved in some local Boston Public School initiatives, not as a researcher, just as a person. This is my interest, right? And so as a human, as somebody who has this interest and cares about the outcomes for these children, I just want to get involved. And so when you're going into spaces and getting involved, and I know not everybody has, right, unlimited hours in the day, but I did find out that I spend an inordinate amount of time playing games on my phone. So if I can cut that down a little bit and instead go out and get a little bit involved in the community, then those relationships sort of happen over time. A lot of organizations will see you coming a mile away if you're coming in specifically looking to do research and things like that. And they're like, they've done it, they've worked with people, they've been burned, right? They're kind of over it. And so sometimes this stuff takes time to develop relationships. And sometimes you work in a space and that never becomes the space that you work with as a community partner, but they know somebody, right? And they put you in contact with somebody in another space. And that's great. And so I guess what I'm saying is sometimes these community relationships arise because you've shown a genuine interest, and not because you've come in there as a researcher wanting to work with this community.
Yeah, I would say, as someone working in Chicago, it's just not the type of place where an outsider comes in and they're happy to hand over the data, hand over the information. I didn't go to high school in Chicago, so I'll never be a true Chicagoan anyway. But so I think like Dania said, you have to make relationships without any expectation that you're going to extract something from it. You will learn about the context and the institutions and the people anyway. You'll learn about yourself too. And then the connections will start to come more, organically. And so a lot of people who have had success with this, they're reaching back to a community they were already a member of, where they already kind of contributed. And so it's harder to do from scratch. And you can do a bit of both. I think if you are you have an urgency and you want to work with an organization or something, you know, at the very least, you need to be sponsored. You need someone to you know, to who who can convince people that you're trustworthy. And then you have to be trustworthy. So
That's
you
right.
can also find people to bridge the gap to introduce you. And that might work better than cold calling. Um, and so you have to be open to sharing the credit with other people. You know, I'm gonna make this person who's not a scholar, I'm gonna make them a co-author on this study. And they are actually gonna be a real co-author in the study. You know, for example, I'm gonna make this person that's been working here for years a PI. They're gonna get paid to be on this project. You know, so you know, you have to be genuine too.
Believe that we are coming towards the end of our time. I want to extend just a really big thank you to Damon and Dania, and I hope everyone will join me in thanking them for their time, for their thoughtful responses to all of the questions, and also just a big thank you for all of the work that you have done and continue to do on our advisory committee. It's been really engaging, and I think we've all really learned a lot and learned that there is a lot more to continue learning in this space. So thank you very much. And I also want to just shout out like everybody for joining and being so engaging during the session. We've appreciated your questions, the chat engagement. And we hope that you'll stay connected with us. So I think we'll also drop in the chat some of these links as well, but we have a feedback form. We want to hear from you. We want to know sort of what you learned, what you still want to learn. It helps us think about how we can continue creating these spaces and these types of conversations. And then there are also ways that you can stay connected with JPAL North America by joining our newsletter to stay up to date on the things that we're working on. We have a webpage on our racial equity work that you can also visit. And as Damon mentioned, we have an open call for proposals right now for researchers in our network. So don't forget to check that out. If you're interested in applying, you'll find all of the details on our website.